So, if you were to have told me about 20 years ago that I would be standing in front of a live audience today talking about the fact that I'm going deaf and blind, I would have told you that I'd rather die. I know it sounds dramatic, but it's the truth. I have something called Usher Syndrome. Usher Syndrome is the leading cause of deaf blindness around the world. There are 3 types of Usher Syndrome. A person living with Usher Syndrome Type I is born completely deaf and progressively losing her vision. A person born with Usher Syndrome Type II is born with a set amount of hearing loss and is progressively losing her vision. And a person living with Usher Syndrome Type III, which is what I have, experiences the mildest onset of both progressive vision and hearing loss. I was actually diagnosed with the vision part of my condition, retinitis pigmentosa, or RP, when I was 12. I had difficulty seeing the blackboard at school. My dad took me to the optometrist. The optometrist said there was something in the back of my eye and his equipment was not sophisticated enough to identify what it was. So I was sent to an ophthalmologist, and the ophthalmologist ran a series of tests and said that I had retinitis pigmentosa, a retinal degenerative condition, and that I would be blind by the time I was 30. It wasn't until about 8 years later or so, when I was actually a sophomore at the University of Michigan, and I'd woken up one morning with really loud ringing in my ears. And for those of you who have ever attended a really loud concert, and you leave and you experience that ringing in your ears, it's what's known as tinnitus. Oftentimes, war veterans return from war and report experiencing tinnitus, ringing, after being exposed to very loud noise, like explosions. So after about 2 weeks of having this ringing, I figured, I should probably go and get this checked out. So I went to the medical center at the University of Michigan, and I saw an otolaryngologist, and he ran another series of tests, and he said, "Rebecca, you don't actually just have RP, you have something called Usher Syndrome. We've never seen it as it presents itself in you, but because you have vision and hearing loss and it's progressive, it can't be anything else." Usher syndrome coming from the Greek word run together or concurrence. It took researchers about 10 years and a lot of blood work from my own family to identify Usher Syndrome Type III. Today, there are about 100 people in the world who have Usher Syndrome Type III. So that means I'm a rare breed. I remember not long after that diagnosis, when I was at school, I was trying to come to terms with what that even meant. What would it mean to be deaf and blind? And of course, I had no idea how to cope with it, and so I decided that if I could be as physically perfect and academically perfect as possible, then nobody would know that there was anything wrong with me, that I had flaws. And I developed an eating disorder. And of course, an eating disorder was a very controlled way of trying to control something I had absolutely no control over, and it was a wonderful form of avoidance, and it did me no good in coming to terms with my condition. Several weeks after my diagnosis, I returned home after a long day of classes, and I turned on the TV, and it was either Oprah Winfrey or Phil Donahue, and the talk show host was interviewing a woman who had been severely injured in an accident and was now living as a quadriplegic. And I remember the talk show host interviewing this woman and her saying that her life was far more meaningful than it ever had been, far more fulfilling than it ever had been when she was fully able-bodied. And I remember rolling my eyes and thinking it was the most cliche and predictable thing I had ever heard. And I shut the TV off, and in that moment, I also knew that I would have to arrive at that place of acceptance that she was discussing on that talk show in order to have a meaningful and fulfilling life myself. So, the summer after my diagnosis, I lived at home in California, And I was reasoning with this whole Usher syndrome thing, and I said, okay, fine, I'll have Usher syndrome, but what's in it for me? And it turns out the Department of Rehabilitation in California offers free Braille tutoring and free cane training, and you even get a shiny new cane. So I thought, well, that's cool, right? So please do not mistake this as an acceptance of my disability, because I actually drove to my cane training. So if you aren't freaked out by the idea of someone pulling up their car, getting out, and unleashing their cane, then I don't know what would freak you out. So after my cane training, I folded up the cane, I got back in my car, and let's be clear, I only drove during the day. I took the cane home and I threw it in my junk drawer next to all of my cassette tapes with Barry Manilow and my rubber band balls and even my Valentine's Day cards from 5th grade that had Garfield on them. Never to see that cane again, right? So I returned to college and I didn't bring the cane with me. And in fact, I would have rather people thought that I was stumbling around drunk than visually impaired. And I think people often mistook me for being drunk because I was so averse to having them think that I was visually impaired. It wasn't until I'd actually graduated from the University of Michigan and I was living in Los Angeles. And it was around this time of year, it was October, daylight savings. And oftentimes people with retinal degenerative conditions, visual impairments, will express feeling as though their vision has gotten worse when it gets darker earlier because we have less light to help us navigate. So it was around this time of year, and I was stuck in terrible LA traffic, and I was pretty freaked out, and luckily by the time I'd reached our garage of our apartment building, I just made it there after the sun had gone down. And nobody was home. I'd lived with a couple of roommates. But I figured, I should really get that cane and dust it off and maybe give it another whirl. So I found the cane and I brought it out to the street, and by then it was completely dark out. We lived on a street that was very heavily populated with trees, so it made it even darker. And I got my cane and I unfolded it and I took it to the corner to cross the street. And as I got to the corner, I saw a man pull up in his car with his headlights beaming forward. And I sort of willed him to keep driving because I wanted to have this experience for myself alone. And of course, he saw a woman standing there with a cane, and he probably wanted to make sure that I got across the street safely. So I took a deep breath in and out, and I got my cane, and I made my way out into the crosswalk in front of his car. And I remember, as I passed in front of his car, I felt the beam of his headlights illuminate my entire body and the cane. And so by the time I'd reached the other side of the street, my face was streaming with tears because it was such an announcement. It was my coming out. It was me telling the world that I need help, that I'm blind, that no matter what else there is about me, first and foremost, you will know that I have a disability, and I hated it. So I decided I gotta move to New York City because I figured nobody really drives there. Everybody takes public transportation or cabs or they walk. I would kind of be in the same boat as everybody else. And to be honest, I thought the bright lights of the big city would help me see better when I needed to navigate at night. So I masked it under the guise of pursuing my master's degrees, which I did. And people ask me today, well, so Rebecca, what made you actually decide to really use your cane regularly? And there were actually two incidences. The first of which was on a particularly rainy night. I was going to a friend of mine's 40th birthday party, and of course, I had my hair blown out and I was looking good, and of course I didn't have my cane with me because it didn't match my outfit. And the next thing I knew, I was lying upside down on a stairwell in a New York City cellar, spread eagle in a dress. and I'd realized that I'd fallen down one of the open cellar doors. So by the time I'd crawled my way out of it, I looked a little bit more like Carrie from the 70s horror movie. And that was what led me to decide to start carrying my cane. So it wasn't until a little while later that I was walking down a street. Again, this time of year, it was darker earlier, and I didn't have my cane in hand. I had it with me. And I was walking down what I believed was an unobstructed street. And I ran smack head-on into a steel gate. So as I hobbled my way to my office, I realized I really need to use this cane. I can't just carry it with me. So let's be clear. The first 5, 6, or 7 times I used my cane, I cried, which in New York, we've seen it all. It wasn't that particularly out of the ordinary to see a blind woman crying down the street. But I cried the first 5, 6, or 7 times because I was no longer just living with a diagnosis. This diagnosis had become my reality. I was quite literally mourning the loss of my vision. I was mourning the loss of what I believed was my independence. And yet, I remember one night I'd locked my office door and I'd walked with my cane in hand to the crosswalk, and I was waiting for the light to change. And once it did, I crossed the street with my cane, and I got to the other side, and I thought, oh wow, I'm not crying. And not only was I not crying, but I realized I was walking a lot faster, I felt a lot safer, and this cane was giving me a lot more information that my vision no longer could. So, today, I have about 10 degrees of my central most vision. If a normally sighted person has 180, I have just 10 in the center. So take a moment, take your hands, make little binoculars, make them a little smaller, look around, and that's about what my vision looks like if I can try to explain it to you in some way. I have a cochlear implant and a hearing aid, and without them, I am completely deaf, and nobody sleeps better than I do, especially in New York City. So, telling you that is really my way of saying that on an everyday basis, I need to ask for help pretty often, and not just from my closest friends and loved ones, from really anybody, depending on the circumstance, right? The irony is, I'm a psychotherapist. My job is to help people, and yet when I use my cane and I'm standing in a room full of people, I am likely the last person someone is going to ask for help, right? So I thought to myself, well, why do people not ask for help? And there are 3 reasons I could think of. One of which is we're taught to be autonomous. We're taught to be independent, right? And the second reason is when we ask for help, it makes us feel as though we're telling people we're not capable. And we do not want people to think that we are incapable. And lastly, as Brené Brown so brilliantly spoke about in her TED Talk, it requires us to be vulnerable. And there's nothing we hate more than being vulnerable. More importantly, it makes us feel needy. Nobody wants to feel needy. In fact, we want to feel needed, not needy. So, if you've ever helped an elderly person get across the street, you've given them their arm, that moment there is a connection. You've created a bond. And as you make your way across the street and you leave them there and they thank you, there is no better feeling than knowing that you have helped that person not only get across the street safely, but that you've made their life a little easier. You've helped them. There is no purer form of humanity than offering help, accepting help, helping yourself, receiving help. When you experience that feeling, that is the same feeling that you give someone else when you ask for help, they give it to you, and you thank them. Because when you ask someone for help, you're letting them know that they are needed. When you ask someone for help, you let them know that they matter. And there is nothing we want more in this life than to know that we matter. My sister and my stepmom and I summited Mount Kilimanjaro in July of 2015. I'd always been fascinated with Africa. I'm an animal lover. I love the outdoors and hiking. And we'd finally gone. And I remember when we would hike, my sister would always be hiking miles ahead of us. And I was so jealous of the fact that she could go as quickly and effortlessly, it appeared to me, as she did, because she was so able-bodied. And of course, I was assigned one of the guides to hike with me the entire way. His name was Innocent, as in not guilty. And what I realized was that having Innocent with me the entire way, him helping me, actually created a bond between us. He taught me Swahili, I taught him sign language, we sang Michael Jackson together, even a little R. Kelly. Impressive, I know. And it was the ultimate form of humanity, being able to receive help, to form that bond, and to live my life accepting that I needed help. Humanity's essence is needing help, is giving help, is receiving help, and helping yourself. And I am living proof. Thank you.